Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm here with my co-hosts Daniel Quinn and Courtney Staples. On today's episode, we are in part 2 of World of 1,000 Words, brought to you by our patron, Commissar Whiskers. But before we get into today's episode, a couple of reminders. Number one, this is the second part of a 2-part episode. So as always, I recommend that you go back and listen to last week's episode because otherwise it's going to be a little bit confusing, obviously. And secondly, if you want us to build your world like we are with Commissar Whiskers, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, where you can click the link, follow some instructions, and within a reasonable amount of time, we'll be building your world. We're also on social media over on YouTube and Twitter with @Let'sWorldBuild being our Twitter handle due to character names, etc. Anyway, but if you want to talk to us more directly, we've got a Discord where you can chat with us about all sorts of world building, all sorts of fiction, whatever you want. Come on over to the Discord, hang out. And if you're feeling particularly generous or just want access to our sweet, sweet patron-only goodies, you can go to our Patreon and give us money there for a, hey, thanks for the podcast type of thing. Or, hey, I'm here for an exchange of goods and services. Give me all of those sweet patron-only access goodies. That's fine too. We're not here. Anyway, just go to our Patreon if you like, so you can get 2 episodes for your prompts like Commissar Whiskers does. And speaking of, the last we left off, we had a twist, which was now add in some robots. And I love me some robots, but before we get into what I have to say, Courtney, why don't you start us off? How did we reconcile with the twist of add in some robots? What did you have in mind?
Yeah, I didn't think this was too hard of a twist to reconcile, given that you can kind of do anything with the magical words that you can write. So my thought was that there are golems that are infused with this magical writing that gives them life and probably has them run on like a command line, essentially, of predetermined tasks that they can do. And maybe there are some very advanced ones that act a bit more human-like or have more will of their own, but imagining like a lot of fairly simple helper golem bots.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I had in mind. Mine is a little bit more specific than that, where I took your idea of, well, okay, I'm going to expand on this lore just a little bit from what I've got going for it. Because I'm like, yeah, you've got robots, like I can see them integrating well within this magical system. No problem whatsoever, right? However, what I was thinking is, okay, these probably mesh well with your tenet of like the discs that have, or the ability to transmit sound and stuff like that. So what I did is I took the idea of like the golem or the robot, and I was like, oh, these are just like the most efficient teachers, because robots, when they're like instructing, they're just playing those disc sounds for them. And I'm also thinking that robots are the first things that can't, like, when they read something, that it doesn't like activate the magic because there's some level of sentience that's involved there. So yeah, that's kind of how I thought about it, where it's like, yeah, most of the teachers in this world are going to be robots with like, you know, like disc men basically set up inside of them. That's what I had in mind anyway.
My main idea with it was that these machines were, when Courtney had talked about in the very beginning, they must have found a way to communicate the writing without activating it, and so that was the recording of audio. And so my thought was that these machines were the mechanism for doing that in the very beginning. So they were created to be able to do that kind of communication, which I think jives with everything that you guys are saying.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I did wonder, Rob, something you said about magic requiring a certain amount of sentience. Like, can a robot golem thing write magic? Is it capable of that if it has a command to do so? And if so, what would happen?
So I believe in the first episode, we talked about this idea that words themselves have this kind of mind of their own, right? That there is an inherent power within the symbology of what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, which is why like people who were illiterate could still infuse writing and stuff like that, and could still like mimic magic to a certain degree, right? So my thinking is that that's basically like wild magic. But when it comes to these robots, they can mimic like the lines and stuff like that. But I don't think that they're infusing magic while doing so. However, I'm also okay with it being similar to someone who is illiterate, where it is a muted or altered effect. But in my brain, I'm thinking that what is fueling the magic in part is some connection to sentience, and that will actually connect later to my faction. But I'm going to put a pin in that for now.
I think we had some notion that there's intention carried through by the person who authors it. And so I think it's simple enough to say that the machines don't have intention. So
exactly.
Like,
yes.
So like when I write, so I think with the illiterate people, that the tattoo artists, they don't understand what the words are saying. So they're kind of imparting their own meaning to the terms, but they're still conveying some sort of intention. I believe we decided that the effects are lesser, especially if they're copying something that they don't understand. Like, because I would think the prompt itself, the act of writing out the words still makes something happen regardless. Yeah. But I think in our discussions, we found that the effect of the words require interpretation, which requires intention. So then if the machines don't have either sentience or they don't have a way of intending anything, then it's just like they're rote copying stuff. And so the words wouldn't activate, I'm guessing.
That's very much what I have in mind, Daniel. Yeah, like there is something, like humanity is something special. The intent is required. And I think that's a really interesting conceit to kind of play around with the magic, while also offering a sort of restriction, right? Like what, like there is, however unlikely, a chance that a word is spelled out in the wild by natural happenings. And I don't think that that intention could be then expressed in like a magical spell. I don't think that would mean that the world itself is really wild and chaotic. And, like, when does the thing count as a word? Like, I think that what Daniel said, the idea of intent really matters. And so that's why that's why I'm trying to like rein it in just a little bit by adding that necessity of consciousness, or as Daniel said, intent, which I think is perfect. So yeah.
What do you mean by like being spelled out in the world?
Okay, so this is going to just sound weird, but this is just going to be a weird example, right? Let's say that it rains and the water just so happens to trickle down to spell out the word wet, or
I see.
orb, or something like that.
Right? Okay.
Like it's highly unlikely. However, there is still a chance that that is what happens, right? So that we have to make sure is like, because if that's the case, we're getting like massive like explosions of chaos magic pretty much worldwide, which could be fun. But I think that to add some level of cohesion and some level of like axiom to the world itself, we need to have intent. We need to have that kind of deliberateness to magic.
Yeah. And then going back to the robots too, like, could they be given intent? Like, if their programming, their written magic programming includes like do XYZ with this intent or this feeling, like, does that translate over? Basically, I'm thinking about like an artificial intelligence from this magic.
I'm so glad that you brought up my faction, Courtney, because I was thinking that for my faction, what would happen is, like we have these robots, we have these things that are being inscribed, like literally inscribed with intent. And so if I'm thinking that there's an intent or a consciousness that people are inscribing in their magic, and it's being either carried by or, very often used around the robots, I imagine that their steel shells or their whatever their chassis is made out of, like eventually that kind of intent, that kind of consciousness seeps into the material itself. And, like I imagine that my faction is a series of semi-conscious robot people.
Mhm.
That's what I got. That's it. I mean, like that alone is, I think, a really interesting idea because it's this is another unintended side effect of the magic itself, where you're carrying around this magic, or you're infused by it so much that eventually you become a swirl of magical consciousness, and it just imbues itself within the chassis of the robot itself. That's what I got. That's very simple, but I like the idea of it.
I like the sense that over time some sort of intention gets conveyed from point A to point B. It makes me think of, again, one of our favorites to reference in Scavenger's Reign, when the robot is exposed to the environment, and eventually the environment sort of alters its circuitry and changes its consciousness. It gives it the kind of independent consciousness different than how it was programmed. So I wonder if there's a medium or a mechanism in the environment, or whether it comes from the people that they're built by or interact with, that causes this to happen, rather than, because like what I want to avoid is like this happened for these machines because they're always being inscribed and used for communication. But like, suppose, I don't know, you had like an abacus or something you placed on some shelf. You don't want that to become conscious over time. So I wonder if there's like some process by which this happened. I mean, could it be as simple as like, because they're also used to be the original way of conveying language without activating magic, like could it be their resonances that eventually awaken something? Because I imagine at the very beginning these aren't like fully fledged robots. They're probably like, golems made of stone and primitive locomotion. They're not barely even machines. So like, what is it? What's the evolution to consciousness like? Was there a triggering mechanism? Is there a specific thing that does this for them? I think that would be interesting to use, because then it could be used elsewhere.
Yeah, like we had talked last time about how the medium with which we write can matter. So I wonder if that's related here, whether it was intentional or on purpose, that whatever was used to like write their magical code was in something that gave them life.
Are they made of a particular material that when it's inscribed into that material, it did it? Because we know that with the reason why the illiterate can tattoo into their bodies and have things happen even though they don't understand the words is because the medium is flesh. So I wonder if there's something about the medium of the machines that gives them sentience over time.
Well, I mean, first of all, those are all fantastic ideas. So great job there. But I think what Courtney was kind of getting at earlier is what sparked me to kind of jump the line and start talking about my faction, which was, like the idea of like, can you inscribe intent? Can you like ask the robot to be like, hey, can you be sentient? Can you can you think? Right? Like, you're programming something and you can't just be like, okay, I'm programming it to think like independently. That's not how a programming language necessarily works, right? But I imagine that maybe there is something to that, where there is a combination of material and desire to instill upon that material sentience. Because what I'm thinking of is Felden of the Third Path. This is a Magic the Gathering reference. I apologize for nothing. I've been really getting into Commander again lately. But he loses his wife, and he spends the rest of his life attempting to create her again out of artifice, like literally create a simulacra of her in her entirety. And it's his life's obsession. And I'm thinking that there might be something to that, where it's like, maybe there is some crazed mage out there who loses a son, loses a child, and desires to reconstruct them, perhaps using the flesh and bone of that deceased child, but then recognizes that that doesn't work somehow. But then that is the devotion of the rest of their life, is to instill or is to recreate this sentience that they lost somehow. That's where my brain is going with it.
Yeah, I like the idea of an original creative thing, like as opposed to, because it seems like there's two directions here. One is this happened by accident over the course of using these things, right? That's one direction. What you're suggesting is there was an inciting incident, right? And I also like the possibility that flesh has something to do with it, because we know this already works with tattoos and bodies, that it alters the way things work. So maybe, like you said, there was someone who died and they tried to literally recreate them using parts of that person's body, which is grotesque, in a machine. And the process of inscribing them gave that first sentience, which then over time gives rise to this new kind of race of people. Because now those things aren't really machines, right? They're like created beings. And that's differentiates them from these teacher bots we have that can read the magic without causing it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like both directions that we could go in there. But Courtney, what do you think? Which direction do you find more appealing? Which do you think is more interesting?
Probably the grotesque one that involves, using a loved one's remains to create something new.
I realize how dumb my question was.
Right.
As soon as you started to answer it, I'm like, yeah, no, that's, of course, Courtney's going to go. Yeah, no, that makes sense. The tracks. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of cool because they're kind of like Frankenstein monster people, like as a race. And I wonder that, like, after the first creation, like, were there a few more made and then they were able to self-propagate? Like, is it like there must be some history after that that made them into a people, right? That are different than the machines that are just read the instructions.
Yeah, I would imagine that if they have this capability, then they can learn to do that magic and construct new ones.
Maybe they steal people's faces and make new ones.
Maybe they even like deconstructed themselves a bit to see how they worked and then made new ones like that.
Yeah, that's fucked up.
Okay, you're welcome.
What I am admittedly slightly concerned about is, how are we not immediately just creating a robot golem apocalypse at that point? Because I would imagine that they're like, oh, well, we can't self-propagate without human body parts. Yeah. So time for a genocide, I guess? Yeah, no, Daniel, no.
But like, why would that necessarily be their goal? They don't necessarily
to propagate?
To have like a mass population. Like maybe they're just like content with just a group to chill out with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they might have an alien intention. I mean, the other thing too is like, maybe they don't have to have living bodies to do this. Like maybe they can take the dead and build new bodies with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hold on. What if these are like, I like what you just said, Daniel, because now I'm thinking like, okay, are these just vessels for living magic itself? It's not like a consciousness as though we might know it, but it is like, hey, we're going to instill the essence with this thing and puppet around a little robot body. But there is a grander sentience, an alien sentience that we have no concept of, but it is effectively like living magic to a certain.
Well, I guess the question in this setting is, what is magic? So far, it just seems to be the ability to alter reality based on what you've written out. So convert your intention to actions in the world, right? So then does that mean, following that reasoning, that these beings are literal converted intention? So then we would have to ask, in the first created one, the intent was to restore his lost love, right? Mm-hmm. So is that carried over and made incarnate? And then that being that's then created, and when it creates others, does it mean it creates beings that have a singular intent? Like, suppose that being that was created, being a Frankenstein's monster, felt horrible and never felt truly its own identity and fled from its creator, right? And so then it created another, and in that one it intended to have a sort of centeredness and identity. So that one has an identity and a centeredness to it, and that's the whole of it. That's its magic. And the next one it creates, maybe it wanted a friend. So the next one it creates is very friendship oriented. And so it goes on and on until each of these are a form of intent embodied.
So they kind of like decide what they need, what's missing in them, what's making them incomplete, and then create it.
I love that. And then they themselves can become complete by seeing it in another.
Yeah, yeah. I like that.
That is weirdly beautiful and tragic and sad all at this. Like, you're just creating a daisy chain of emotional needs. And
Yeah.
it's like,
And that's what binds them as a people.
Yeah.
yeah, but also at the same time, like, isn't that like really inherently essentialist? Like, it's like the whipping boy, right? Where it's like, or it's like those who walk away from Omelas, where it's like we need someone to embody like
Yeah.
injustice so we can lock them in a closet and only feed them once a week, like.
Well, there's a loving intent in each creation, just as you would with a child and a parent. Like, if I am lonely and my intent was to not be lonely, and that's what I've created, this thing that represents companionship, the act has a good intent. But I'm also not bothered by the possibility of essentialism. Like, I feel like, especially in literature nowadays, everybody's like, oh, you can't have that because it would be socially inappropriate. Like, fuck you. That's the point of literature, is to explore those things. So, like, that's what if that's problematic, well, then let's figure out what does that mean for this people, right? Those consequences are what make literature exciting. That's what makes, any of the books we've read exciting, as we explore problematic things.
For our audience, what do you mean by essentialism in this case?
I can let Rob answer that. But what I mean is when you reduce something to a particular characteristic. So, like, orcs are inherently evil because they're all savages. That would be an essentialist take on an orc.
Yeah, Daniel, you took the words right out of my mouth, like the Meatloaf song. Like, yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's like an essentialist viewpoint would be, you are an orc, therefore you are evil. Right. Whereas, like, it is very much inscribing a particular ideal onto a thing or person based on preconceived notions. So there is like essential gender studies stuff. So it's like men are inherently violent, right? Because they are men. That's an essentialist viewpoint of kind of gender, right? And I think, Daniel, you're right in the idea that exploring essentialism in this way can be really interesting. I think that it, like, as long as we're using this medium to kind of like deconstruct that, like, hey, yeah, what does like creating a friend whose only desire or whose only will intent is companionship, what does that look like? How does that happen? Like, I think that's kind of interesting. So I'm not opposed to the idea of exploring essentialism.
I mean, and I would add too, like, take Lord of the Rings, right? Like, the orcs are redeemably evil. They're created from evil intent. And I don't think that's a problematic thing in that story, because this is a story that's about high fantasy and good and evil, and it is about essentialism to some degree. Now, if you were writing, I don't know, a modern book that had orcs as a people, and they have a culture, and they have family and all these other aspects to them, then yeah, you couldn't portray them as essentialists, because that would be boring. They wouldn't make any sense as a people. So it's like, we gotta consider the context, right? And I think in this world, these robot creatures, like, the idea is that they are the embodiment of intent. So that's why we can get away with doing that, I think.
I think it can also be an interesting parallel sort of to like parenthood. Like, Daniel, you mentioned children, like a parent and child relationship, and like, why do parents have children? Some do it for this, urge to grow their family. Some do it because they just want to have somebody to be able to watch them when they get old and take care of them. Some do it to I don't know, carry on their genes because they think their genes are superior. It's all these different reasons that what?
Courtney?
Yeah.
I never got to be a professional football player, so by God, I'm going to have so many children, and I'm going to drill them until one of them is a professional football player. And that is why I have children. Like, yeah, exactly. We have children for different reasons.
Yep.
Not that that's ever happened ever. No one's ever tried to live vicariously through their children. Ever.
Oh God, no. No, never.
Okay. That's my faction, by the way. I know we've spent a long time talking about it, and I'm cool with that. But also, you guys have cool ideas that I want to hear as well. But I do want to go back to them because I'm also thinking like, man, warped reflections of intent as like a means to propagation is really fucking fascinating. Like, oh, I need to be safe. I want someone who is going to make me feel safe. How is that reflected in the intent? But we're not going into that now because Daniel and Courtney's got to explain what their factions are. Courtney, you were first. I jumped ahead. So obviously that means that you're next. What do you got for us?
Perhaps coming as a surprise to no one, but my faction is a faction of witches who do their magic writing, spell casting using the medium of menstrual blood. And
yeah.
there's a lot of like emphasis on group casting of spells. So I'm picturing like a ritual that takes place where there are multiple witches sort of writing in this. They each have their own like intertwining circle or line that runs alongside or intertwines with others, that each contains their own text, but they work together ultimately as a much more powerful spell.
Wow, unhygienic.
That is the most Daniel response that I could ever imagine.
Just hand them some wet wipes, some Lysol wipes.
Yeah.
Oh.
Listen, I am all for Mensis as like as a means for medium. So yeah, I'm down with that 100%. Oh man, I want to make so many snail trail jokes that I'm not going to. So let's go ahead. And all right. So what purpose, what role do you see your faction having within this kind of greater narrative that we're establishing here, Courtney?
That I wasn't totally sure about. Mainly just wanted the menstrual blood witches, but I think they would be probably doing a lot in secret away from the bulk of civilization. Like I could see it being a life and death form of magic, given what menstrual blood can symbolize in terms of lifeblood, but also an absence of life leaving the body. So I think that would be interesting to have them be like focusing a lot on major moves, major spells that revolve around life and death. I'm not sure if it would be like something as direct as like an assassination or I don't know, a baby boom, but it could also be tending to the earth, like making crops grow or die, things like that.
So it sounds to me like we want to stick to the more traditional fairy tale version of what witches, like the more Salem version of what witches can do, which is like wither or increase the production of crops and people, right? So we're talking boons and banes, right?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, that's what I had in mind. But I'm open to other ideas if you guys have other thoughts.
What I think is really interesting about your faction is this idea of community, right? So what about ritual? What about communal magic is different than the individual? What about their communal magic? They're like cauldron-based magic, right? Where it's just filled to the brim with Mensis blood, right? Like, what about that is different than an individual writer sitting and scribbling away at his pad, alone in some kind of wizard tower? Like, what is the inherent difference there?
Well, as Daniel said, it's very unhygienic. But in addition to that, I would say like perhaps an openness to the input of others, an openness to the unknown, that sense of like natural chaos that can occur when you're a part of something and not fully in control of it.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking about when we were talking about last episode, where we had different flourishes, where we had different like demarcations of a personal style. And I'm imagining that what's going on here is this idea of, hey, there is a lack of personal style, or there is a blending of personal styles that changes the inherent magic that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, it would be like if you got a solo artist to paint a mural versus if you got like a cooperative artist to paint one blending their own styles. It would come out definitely much different and might have a more interesting result.
It makes me wonder, and this is adjacent to this, if there's a connection between the sort of thing that illiterate tattoo people do with the sort of stuff these are doing, because they both involve blood
Yeah,
in the body.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't consider that.
Maybe it's like maybe they view it as like a purer or more more connected form of magic since it consists of things of yourself.
Okay. I like the idea of like reifying the idea of a coven. Their magic, like they bind themselves together. So witches bind themselves together in covens, right? I'm now thinking that they can manipulate magic in a way where if they cast one spell, it affects all of them equally, or all of them to maybe a less severe extent. So they're able to increase the prosperity of their community by binding themselves together, by being like, hey, listen, we're all going to thrive together as long as we have this singular intent, as long as we're able to be bound together in Mensis blood. Something like that, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm also now thinking that like the tattoo part is like Daniel, I think you're correct in thinking that there's something to that there's something to like binding the witches with the tattoos in some way. And maybe that's like a way of showing that you are loyal to a specific coven. It's like, listen, I'm decked out in these tattoos, right? I don't know. There's something there. It's like, I feel like I'm close to something. We're close to something.
Maybe it's about like everyone in the coven tattooing each other. So like you have a bit of everybody on your skin, basically.
I like that. And I think this could be, if we think back to what the purpose of tattooing oneself is. The reason why you do it is because you don't understand the words you're putting in your body, but you're inscribing your own intent to them while being illiterate. I wonder if the witches, especially if they're all tattooing each other with menstrual blood, for God's sake, if they're doing this, then it makes me wonder if perhaps they are trying to change language. So if words typically mean a certain thing in the language, and the use of them is mediated by the writer's intention, perhaps by taking other people's words and putting them into yourself in this very intimate sort of way, you could change the language, and they have this agenda about the world and about language.
That's very cool, because that also brings in that aspect of like classical witchcraft where there's a like Satan's involved and they pledge themselves to worship Satan and serve him, and in this case they're almost like pledging themselves to language and magic,
and to a new language of their own,
remember that historical accounts have people signing their book or their name in the book, right? So it is a matter of it's an oath, it's a pledge. And I'm also thinking that there is some kind of interesting idea of like pledging yourself to an ideal or a community. And like there's like rituals where you tattoo one another to show your intent of loyalty to one another to an extent. So like you look at someone and they might be illiterate, but all of the symbols that they have on their skin are the names of their fellow community members, the names of their fellow coven. And so like I think there's something really rich about that concept too, especially if it's like, you know what happens when those community members dies, what happens to the name on their skin? Does it fade? Does it stay? Like I think there's a lot that you could do with that for sure.
Yeah. Death is an interesting question there. And initially I'm thinking like maybe that magic would live on in a certain way beyond their death if it's infused like with their own blood into somebody else, but I'm not sure.
I mean, there's a certain level of existential crisis that you can avoid by suggesting that as long as my name is on someone's body, I will live on.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not going to get into my existential crisis here on the podcast, but yeah, that's what we got. Also, damn, that's cool. Like, I like the ideas that we're running with here. So I also think it's time that we move on to Daniel's faction. Daniel, what do you got for us?
I was thinking back to a short story called The 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke. And in that one, essentially, there's these monks looking for the names of God, and they've calculated that there's a certain number of them, 9 billion. And they resort to using a computer in modern times to find the last bits because they write them out by hand. And by pronouncing all the names of God in this way, you destroy the world. So, and that's what happens in the story, which is great. But I was interested because I was wondering if there is a cult of people who are searching for a certain number of symbolic terms or words or whatever, and that once they've assembled all these words, some dramatic thing will happen. And so, they're trying to find, it's similar to what you were hinting at, Rob, of like an underlying fundamental language, which is their theory, perhaps, that if they were to collect all of these words, they would be able to do something dramatic. And it doesn't have to be the end of the world, but maybe it's something that's positive. But that's my notion, is that there is this cult, a mystery cult that is looking for specific words to construct either maybe this perfect passage or this perfect spell or whatever it is across all languages and cultures.
Daniel, I love that idea so much.
Yeah, that's very cool.
I also kind of want to take your idea and run with it a little bit, and we can reel this back as much as we need to. But I think that, yeah, my brain initially went to damnation, right? Doom. People are literally searching for the end of all things. But then I thought, I think you're right in this idea that it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And then I thought, what about competing philosophies about some level of ascension? And now I'm thinking about the gods, the kind of it wasn't Genghis Khan who did this, but it was one of his ancestors, where they basically grabbed a bunch of representatives of each religion between the Abrahamics and the Eastern religions and stuff like that. And they sat them in this big room and they're like, listen, we've got a weekend. You're going to figure out this God thing once and for all. And, like you had, the Abrahamic religions kind of like grouping together, and you had the Eastern religions like kind of coming up with like all these different like counterpoint to try and figure out religion, like, and then everyone got drunk and nothing really ever happened of it, right? Because that's just what happened in those days. But what I'm thinking, what I'm pulling from this is this group that you have is the result of, the folks who are looking for ascension, divination, damnation, or divinity or damnation or doom. And this is what's happened afterwards. This is like several debates, several decades or centuries worth of debates. And this is the ones like, we're here to find perfection. It might be doom. It might be ascension to a higher plane. We're here to find the perfect word, right? Or the ideal of perfection.
Mm.
And again, feel free to pull back as much as you want on that, because I just went with it. My brain's just on fire right now.
Yeah, I feel like they are looking for what I would like is for it to be something very specific, but that it is a singular thing, and that when assembled and pronounced, something important happens. So like, that could be a perfect poem, right? Or it could be, the ultimate curse or something, whatever it is. Like I want it to be something very tangible and specific that when assembled linguistically, it's a thing they can do or use. And maybe it's impossible to do this. And I do like the notion that this cult has evolved from a lot of competing theories about language and landed on this kind of obstinate intent of finding this one particular thing at any cost. I'm trying to think, like, when you think of, like, for example, Dante's Inferno, which is a favorite, poem of mine, giant poem. Like there's so many translations of it, right? So like, what's the perfect one coming from the Italian that actually reflects how it was written? And like, can you find a perfect one? And so I could imagine this cult, whatever they're searching for, it's like it's the most precise or perfect or accurate version of this thing to construct with the language. And it presupposes that this is possible in that it's not a postmodern way of thinking, right? Like it's assuming that beneath all of the differences in all the languages, that there's something fundamental to be found.
Daniel, how do you feel about some Oscar Wilde and the idea that there is beauty or an ideal beauty in some way?
I personally think that's nonsense, but
exactly.
Might think something like that exists, like something platonic underneath everything could be there.
Right, like I think that what I'm trying to get at when I say beauty is this idea that something that is inherently subjective can have an objective purity to it. Because I think that the inherent tension between those two ideas is really interesting in a cult like what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. And it would be nice if it was very simple, whatever it is after.
Yeah, my question is going to be like, what do you picture the cult as in terms of a vibe? Are they like an elite Bohemian Grove kind of deal where you have like, powerful rulers joining together to do this? Is it like this like crazy conspiracy cult that meets in someone's basement? Like what sort of vibe are you thinking?
Yeah, are they spanking their own bottoms? That's what I really want to know. Or
I didn't have a particular visualization, but I feel like that could be part of the use of them in a setting, like you slot them into what you need. But when I was thinking about them, my original thought was thinking back to the 9 billion names of God, like these monks that tend to be reclusive on the fringe of society, operating and toiling in silence. So I could picture these being the same. But I mean, you could certainly construct them as a very elite Bohemian Grove sort of cults. They could be aligned with the witches in some way. They could be scholarly. It could be an industrial university scale sort of thing. It would be a cult then, but I could see it going any of those directions.
Yeah, it could be like, some team developing the equivalent of the Large Hadron Collider kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also thinking of, I believe it was an Umberto Eco story that was later adapted into a Twilight Zone episode where this person comes across this monastery and at night they hear this man howling in the basement and they go down and it turns out that these monks have locked up the devil. Do you know what I'm talking about? Or am I completely off base with my references?
No, I don't know that one.
No idea.
Okay. So yeah, that's the general conceit, is this idea that these monks have the devil, or at least someone who they claim is the devil, locked up, and they're like, he's staying there, he's a prisoner, and then it's up to the protagonist to figure out whether or not they should free the devil or not. Spoilers, it is the literal devil. But
the Name of the Rose? I know that one takes place in a monastery.
Yeah, that is the Umberto Eco story, I believe.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I might be getting my wires crossed entirely. There's also that distinct possibility. But my point is, I'm also thinking that, Daniel, maybe is it about protecting a word, like a forbidden word? Or is it like because I can see your cult kind of doing something like that as well, where it's like, we've got to keep these dangerous elements out because they're going to ruin the ideal, the perfect concept of this thing, I
mean, I think it's about assembly, right? So like if you're trying to construct the perfect poem, you would need the right language, the right syntax, the right enjambment, the right grammar, like everything has to align perfectly, and you have to find all those pieces. Now, I don't think in isolation any of those pieces is problematic or dangerous, right? Like there's no use to a dangling comma by itself, but in the construction of this poem, perhaps it is quite powerful, So maybe they're guarding how the pieces fit together, to answer your question, not so much the individual pieces, because the pieces up by themselves are powerless. Like if there
Ooh.
is a fundamental language to be found, I wouldn't want you to know how to use its syntax.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like this is not your canon, nor is it the canon of the podcast. I'm just thinking like it's the keeper of the comma. You know, it's like the person who knows how to use commas perfectly in every instance.
Yeah. Like it can also be if this was a comedy sort of thing. It could be dumb like that, you know. You don't know.
Oh man, yeah. Okay. All right, cool. I'm very happy with how the factions have kind of worked themselves out. All right, so we've got our factions. We've reconciled with the twist. What is our main storyline? What are we going with?
Like my mind first goes to some mystery surrounding Daniel's cult, and like the protagonists have to investigate what's going on there and make connections and go into seedy basements and interact with these people. But and I wonder if there's something more that we could do.
Ooh, what if like the recent sentience of a particular robot has altered the way that they are looking at their perfect words or researching their perfect words in some way?
I wonder, I mean, all that sounds great, but I wonder what is the setting for this? So yeah, I'm getting, based on how you guys are talking about this, maybe a pseudo-Victorian vibe, because you could have then, these steampunk zombie sort of golems, and you could have a secret society that's sort of gothic in some way. I feel like I need some sort of setting to put this in.
Yeah, no, you raise a good point that this is a world building podcast and we haven't actually defined the world. I think because like it could work kind of anywhere, but yeah, you're right that we should for this.
Just for the story.
Yeah.
So just to go back to what Rob was saying, we've got maybe it's the recent sentience of these creatures, these golems, has some relationship to a mystery involving finding this complete thing with the language. I mean, maybe the words have been found and they've been executed, and this utterance gives life to this first sentient golem thing, and that's the impetus of the story.
Oh, I see.
And you have to work backwards.
Right. Okay, so this golem, again, not what you said, but what I'm running with. Mm-hmm. So the utterance has been said, right? And it's been written down, and everyone involved in that ritual is dead, except for the golem, who now knows this knowledge of the thing that happened. Right?
Maybe the thing they searched for was the secret of life, and it worked, but it kills the utterers and gave life to the thing.
Ooh, that's very cool.
Because like you're inscribing intent life, and it goes and it takes the life from you and it instills it into the thing that you're trying to create. Like, yeah, that I think is really interesting. And also, is the robot basically just a swirling amalgam of the dead cultists? Are they like that's where my brain goes? I don't know.
I wonder if the golem, now being a sentient thing unto itself, has the power of these words and could now create life, but it does so by killing others.
Yeah, maybe it like doesn't quite necessarily recognize that that's a bad thing. It's just doing what it was built to do.
Yeah. And in its mind, I imagine that it's like, I'm not taking life, I'm just moving it. I'm just taking it from here and putting it this way. What's wrong with that? Because it's the embodiment of life. It doesn't understand death. How could it? It's only life.
Yeah. No, I like that.
See echoes of the cultist's psychic memory, because guiding in some way, not intentionally, but like some of the things it does has some resemblance to stuff having to do with them, because that would help the investigators trace their way backwards to what happened.
I feel like their investigation would definitely lead them to at least one coven of witches, since their magic revolves around life and death. So like I imagine that
yeah.
somebody in the cult, took some of that knowledge and used it for this, even though that wasn't what it was intended for.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. Maybe on the party, like there is a witch undercover or secret, that's they have their own intention with language.
Yeah.
They can control life, the language of life,
Yeah.
Okay. We are talking about the idea of the coven kind of like binding themselves to one another. So maybe in doing so, that ritual makes them resistant or immune to this kind of like soul pull or this life pull that the golem has. It's like, it's like pulling a thread, right? Like that is to the golem, that's what life is. You're pulling a thread. And then when you try and pull the thread of one of these coven members, it's like, oh, this is knotted. I can't actually undo this as easily as I would others. And so there is a resistance because they've enmeshed themselves with the blood and their essence with other people.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I like that. And that could be even how like the secret witch in the party is discovered if this golem attempts to take her life or energy or whatever, and she is somehow immune and ends up having to like fess up to the others in the group.
What? Yes, but also why the secrecy there? Like why do you have to protect your coven or protect your admittance into this coven of witches?
Probably because of the Victorian setting they're in, where witches are probably not acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I'm cool with that. Yeah. Look, I'm all for inherent sexism within world building. Okay, truly.
They're weird ladies who live in the woods and draw stuff with their menstrual bloods.
They need to be hanged. So like that's standard. Yeah.
Look, truly, it is too good for them to be drowned in the Lord's water. They need to be burned with cleansing fire. Obviously.
Burned, yeah.
Look, they signed their name in the book. That means they got to get burned out. That's just what happens. Okay, cool. No, this is all coming together. We've got a repressed religious society. We've got the secret society of weird old men trying to look for a meaning of life. We've got blood witches, and we got a robot man.
Can we make it more sexist? Like, what if the mystery cult is only men because they're searching for the secret to life so that they can create life without women?
Yes.
Oh my God. Oh my
That's
God. Perfect.
It's literally just like, I'm so fucking mad that I can't make children. I'm going to be able to make my own kids. I swear. Like, that is literally, it's like just molding the group. Like, that's what it is. Like a deep, deep cult of the church that wants to achieve this. And it's super sexist, like that particular cult.
Yeah.
They want to subjugate women.
Ultimate incels, basically.
Whereas the witches are like, well, fuck that.
You're right.
Guys, I have to wonder if witches get power from communal, like, menstrual blood. Does that mean that bukkake also
No, I already answered the question. No. They're incels. They don't do sex things. That's why they're trying to create life with magic.
So, Courtney, I'm going to ask you now.
Oh, God. Maybe that could be up to whoever's writing the story or, running the game.
Oh, Lord. Yeah, okay. I'm cool with that. Just got a whole mason jar full of it.
On that note.
Oh God, yes. On that note, I feel like we've now made a far more concrete world in our main storyline quest. Thumbs up, we're ready to go, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so, yeah.
Okay. Before I say more about the thing I was talking about earlier, I'm going to wrap up this episode of World Build with us. So a big thank you to our patron, Commissar Whiskers, for this very interesting prompt. It was really fun to kind of take like a magic system and then kind of build a world around that. And I thought it's been a really cool and interesting setting thus far.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that if you want us to build your world, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, where you can click the link, follow some instructions, and you've got access to our YouTube, our Twitter, our Discord, and perhaps most importantly, our Patreon, where you can give us money and we will give your prompt 2 episodes instead of 1. Or if you just want to say, hey, thank you for all the work that you've done. Or if you just want access to the other goodies like, the patron-only Discord or the Too Hot for Broadcast, stuff like that. There's all sorts of good stuff there. But that's going to do it for this episode of World Build with Us. Remember that we love you very much. We're going to get through this together. Until next week.